"You're in violation again, Mr. Reeves," Patricia Hargrove said, her voice clipped as she shoved the paper into my hand. "Your lawn has exceeded the maximum height. You'll be fined until you learn to respect this community." She stood on my front walk beneath the shade of my father's oak tree, eyes gleaming with smug certainty. To her, this was another easy win, another neighbor bent into submission. I glanced at the notice. $15,000 for grass she claimed was half an inch too tall. I let the silence hang, then folded the paper once and slid it back toward her. "Funny thing, Patricia, I've written city compliance reports that carry more weight than this entire HOA. And I can tell you right now, your rule doesn't hold up in court. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. Where are you watching from?" She blinked, thrown off by my calm tone, then scoffed as if my words didn't matter. But I knew the truth carried more force than any threat she could print. I wasn't just another neighbor. I was a licensed civil engineer who'd spent 20 years enforcing codes the right way. And more than that, I was a son carrying a promise carved into the bark of the tree behind me. My father planted that oak before the subdivision even existed, long before Patricia's board stamped its authority on every square inch of Willow Creek Estates. He told me, standing right here with dirt under his fingernails, that the tree would grow taller than both of us, that it would mark our family's place in this world. He never lived to see it tower over the rooftops, but he made me swear I'd protect it. That vow mattered more than a stack of violation letters. When Patricia threatened my property, she threatened him. This wasn't about grass. It wasn't about measurements or neat edges that pleased some committee. It was about respect for a man who worked his whole life to buy this land, who fought for every paycheck so his son could inherit more than bills and memories. Patricia thought she could bully me with fines and deadlines. She didn't see the roots that went deeper than any HOA ordinance. She didn't understand that every inch of this yard carried weight in ways her board could never measure. The paper in my hand wasn't a bill. It was a challenge. And behind the numbers and threats, I could already see the cracks. I'd reviewed bylaws like these for towns twice this size. I knew how they copied language from other states without checking legality. I knew they overreached, assuming no one would push back. Patricia expected me to fold, but she had no idea what I'd already uncovered in the documents they filed years ago. I stood taller, feeling the bark of the oak at my back like armor. "You've picked the wrong yard, Patricia," I said quietly, "and the wrong man." I walked away from Patricia with the violation notice still warm in my hand, but her threats didn't stop at my doorstep. By the next morning, the entire community center's bulletin board carried a copy of the letter pinned right in the middle like a trophy. She wanted everyone in Willow Creek Estates to see me as the villain, the neighbor too stubborn to follow rules, the man dragging down their property values. The bold red stamp at the bottom screamed, "Non-compliant," and I could feel every pair of eyes on me when I stepped into the lobby. Whispers floated through the air, a mother pulling her child close, two men by the coffee machine shaking their heads. Patricia had always relied on shame as her sharpest weapon, and now she'd aimed it squarely at me. To most of them, it probably looked simple. A guy with a messy lawn refusing to pay up. She never mentioned the fine was more than some of their annual salaries. She never explained that the grass wasn't even out of compliance. She twisted the truth until the crowd carried her lie for her. I forced myself to stand straight, my father's words echoing in my head. "Don't let them take your ground." That oak tree didn't bow, and neither would I. Still, I couldn't ignore how deeply Patricia had woven herself into the fabric of this neighborhood. She'd positioned herself as the guardian of order, and anyone who questioned her found themselves plastered to that bulletin board. Today it was me. Tomorrow it would be someone else. I traced the edges of the notice with my thumb, studying the language. Even without my professional training, I could see the inconsistencies, measurements listed without proper units, citations from state codes that didn't even apply here. But the residents around me weren't engineers. They weren't lawyers. They just saw a fine and assumed guilt. That was her strategy, rule by intimidation, hoping no one smart enough or stubborn enough would ever push back. Unfortunately for her, I was both. I moved toward the board, ignoring the hush that followed me. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I pinned my gaze on the notice itself. The numbers glared back, and I felt the weight of my father's promise pressing against my spine. With one sharp tug, I tore it from the corkboard. Gasps rippled through the lobby, but I didn't stop. I folded it, slid it into my pocket, and turned to face the room. "You'll all see soon enough," I said, steady but not shouting. "This isn't about grass. It's about power. And when it breaks, every one of you will feel the difference." I didn't wait for their reactions. My steps carried me through the hall toward the side office where board members usually held their private meetings. The door was cracked open, and I could hear Patricia's voice spilling out, rehearsing her narrative to two other officers. She called me reckless. She claimed my property would drop values across the subdivision. She spoke like a general marshalling. Troops convinced her campaign was unshakable. I leaned closer, not to confront her yet, but to listen. The details mattered. Her arrogance was my advantage. She mentioned bringing in their guy to testify, an old groundskeeper named Bob Langley. I knew Bob, retired, quiet, spent decades caring for parks before the HOA lured him into part-time inspections. He wasn't cruel, just tired. Patricia would twist his words until they cut like blades, but I could already sense his hesitation. That hesitation could be the wedge I needed. The rest of the day, her narrative spread like wildfire. Flyers on doorsteps, emails with subject lines screaming, "Community standards at risk." Patricia was mobilizing fear, and fear was effective. Neighbors began trimming their lawns down to the soil, as if proving loyalty would shield them from her gaze. The community center, once just a neutral gathering space, had transformed into her war room. And me? I'd been cast as the enemy of order, but underneath the noise, I saw the cracks forming, rules improperly cited, threats exaggerated, witnesses uncertain. The entire foundation of her power rested on sand, and I had the training to expose it. Each lie she spread only gave me more to dismantle. Every public shaming only pushed me closer to the moment I'd pull the floor out from under her. As I walked home past manicured lawns and cautious stairs, I ran my hand across the rough bark of the oak. Patricia wanted submission, but what she'd created was resolve. She'd turned my fight into a symbol, and symbols had a way of growing roots deeper than any ordinance could reach. The morning after Patricia's flyers hit every doorstep, I found myself at the Willow Creek Park, a narrow stretch of green where parents pushed strollers and retirees walked laps around the gazebo. I wasn't there for leisure. I was there because Bob Langley always started his day on the same bench near the duck pond, carrying a thermos and a newspaper he barely read. If Patricia was counting on him as her witness, I needed to see for myself where he stood. Bob sat hunched, shoulders curved in a way that made him seem smaller than he was. His thermos shook faintly as he raised it, and I couldn't tell if it was the chill of the morning or something heavier running through him. His eyes avoided mine when I approached, but not out of hostility. It was hesitation, the kind that lives between loyalty and conscience. The bench creaked as he shifted, his knees bouncing restlessly, as if his body couldn't hold still under the weight of Patricia's demands. I stopped a few feet away, not wanting to corner him. "Morning, Bob," I said. He gave a short nod, lips pressed tight, gaze fixed on the ducks gliding across the water. His hand fumbled with the thermos cap, twisting it back and forth, though it was already sealed. That told me more than words could. He was tangled in something he didn't want. The silence stretched, heavy, but not empty. His jaw worked as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't shape the words. When he finally looked at me, it was brief, almost apologetic. Then his eyes darted back to the pond. His foot tapped against the ground, fast and uneven, betraying nerves he tried to mask with a sigh. I'd seen that kind of body language before, in men asked to stand against something they knew was wrong but feared the cost of resistance. I sat at the other end of the bench, leaving space between us. "Patricia's making this bigger than it is," I said quietly. His shoulders tensed. He didn't answer, but the way his knuckles whitened around the thermos told me I'd struck the truth. Patricia had cornered him, leaning on his years of service, his reputation for honesty. She wanted his name to seal her case against me. But Bob wasn't built for lies. The conflict showed in every twitch of his hands, every shift of his weight, as if he couldn't find a position that felt steady. "Grass height isn't the issue," I continued, letting my voice stay calm. "She's using you to justify a power she doesn't have." Bob's head dipped lower, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. His breathing quickened, shallow and uneven, like someone holding a secret too long. He rubbed at his temple, a nervous motion that seemed to grind him down further. The man wasn't my enemy. He was her pawn. I didn't press him to choose sides. That wasn't what he needed. Instead, I gave him the out he was searching for. "When the time comes, all you'll have to do is tell the truth," I said. "Nothing more." He froze, hand mid-motion, then slowly lowered it to his lap. His fingers tapped against his thigh in an erratic rhythm, then stopped altogether. That pause carried more weight than any statement. It was the sound of a man realizing silence wouldn't protect him forever. A child's laughter carried across the park, breaking the tension for a moment. Bob finally muttered something, low, almost inaudible, but the words didn't matter. What mattered was the way his eyes softened, then hardened again, as if two parts of him were at war. The loyalty Patricia demanded versus the integrity he'd built over a lifetime. His struggle wasn't finished, but the cracks in his armor were showing. I could see it in the way he clutched the thermos tighter, like a shield against a battle he hadn't chosen. I rose from the bench, leaving him with his thoughts. Bob didn't stop me, didn't call me back. Instead, his legs started bouncing again, faster this time, as though the weight of choice pressed harder with every passing second. His silence wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. It was the quiet fracture of a man torn between fear and truth. And I knew when the board dragged him into the spotlight, that fracture would decide everything. I left Bob on that park bench with his thermos clutched like a lifeline, but Patricia wasn't wasting time waiting for his conscience to catch up. By evening, a formal letter arrived at my workplace. My secretary slid the envelope across my drafting table with raised brows, as if handling evidence from a crime scene. The HOA had escalated beyond fines. They were threatening to place a lien on my property, claiming unpaid assessments and cumulative violations. The total balance had climbed to over $20,000, inflated by penalties invented out of thin air. The letter's timing wasn't random. Patricia knew exactly where to strike. My reputation as an engineer wasn't just a career. It was the foundation of my credibility. If clients or colleagues believed I was in legal trouble with my own community, contracts could dry up overnight. She was extending her reach beyond my yard, using the HOA's letterhead like a weapon aimed straight at my livelihood. I held the paper under the fluorescent light, reading line by line. Half the citations were riddled with errors, codes misquoted, sections referenced from other jurisdictions. One paragraph even referenced Florida statutes, though we were in a completely different state. It was sloppy, reckless, and telling. Patricia wasn't just stretching authority, she was fabricating it. My chest tightened, not with fear but with confirmation. She was digging her own trap, and every exaggeration was another brick in the wall I'd use against her. Still, the weight of it pressed hard. My coworkers glanced at me with wary eyes, pretending not to read the bold header stamped across the letter. Notice of Lien. I tucked it into my portfolio, refusing to give them a show. If Patricia wanted humiliation, she'd have to work harder than this. At lunch, I drove past the HOA office, a squat brick building tucked behind the strip mall near the highway. Through the wide glass windows, I could see Patricia pacing with two board members, hands slicing the air as she barked instructions. A stack of papers littered the table, probably more violation notices waiting for delivery. She looked energized, as if every escalation fed her sense of control. But control built on falsehoods can't last forever. I knew that. The trick was proving it where it mattered. I parked across the lot and sat in my truck, jotting notes in the margin of her letter. The errors weren't small oversights, they were systemic. If she'd copied entire passages from templates without legal adoption, then every fine tied to those passages was invalid. And if she used those fines to justify a lien, the whole process could collapse under scrutiny. This wasn't just about me anymore. Every neighbor who'd been bullied into paying might have been robbed under the same fraudulent framework. Patricia had turned abuse of power into policy. The image of Bob's shaking hands at the park replayed in my mind. Patricia was counting on him to cover the cracks with his testimony, but I could see the fear in his body language. He wasn't a man, built for lies, and sooner or later, that fear would tilt toward truth. He didn't know it yet, but he was already the fulcrum. When I left the lot, I felt the oak tree's presence even from miles away. Its roots tethered me to something Patricia couldn't touch: integrity, legacy, the promise I carried. She thought escalation would weaken me, but every letter, every inflated fine, only added fuel, My training had taught me to measure, to calculate, to expose weaknesses invisible to others. And now, I was beginning to see her structure clearly. She wasn't running a community. She was running a scheme, one that couldn't withstand the weight of real scrutiny. That night, I spread Patricia's letter across my kitchen table, beside the earlier notices. My father's old toolbox sat on the counter, the smell of oil and cedar rising when I opened it. Inside, tucked between wrenches and screwdrivers, was the survey compass he once used when checking property boundaries. It wasn't just an instrument, it was proof of how carefully he'd measured this land, proof that every inch mattered. I held it steady in my hand, the metal cool against my skin, and felt a calm certainty settle in. Patricia could escalate all she wanted. I was ready to escalate back. The compass from my father's toolbox still sat on the kitchen counter when morning came, its metal gleaming faintly in the first light, pushing through the blinds. I tucked it back carefully, then gathered the letters Patricia had mailed and drove to the county courthouse. If Patricia wanted to escalate this into liens and penalties, she'd drag the fight into territory where I was strongest. Courthouses had rules, filings, and procedures, and unlike Patricia, I respected those boundaries. The records office smelled faintly of dust and copier toner, rows of metal shelves holding binders thicker than bricks. I requested the articles of incorporation and governing documents for Willow Creek Estates, curious to see if the lawn restrictions she wielded so aggressively were even included. The clerk returned with a thin folder, surprisingly small for a neighborhood that boasted nearly 200 homes. I opened it at the nearest desk, scanning the language with an engineer's patience, line by line, section by section. The first thing that struck me was the absence. Nowhere in the founding documents did it mention grass height requirements. Landscaping maintenance was addressed broadly: clear yards, trim shrubs, no hazardous growth. But there was no measurable standard. The infamous 3-inch rule, Patricia waved like a sword, wasn't adopted here at all. My pulse quickened as I flipped to the amendments filed over the years. A few dealt with pool regulations, fence heights, exterior paint colors, but the lawn ordinance, it was missing entirely. What Patricia had been enforcing all this time wasn't codified authority. It was fiction. I took photos of the relevant pages, my phone, buzzing with each capture, the evidence stacking in my gallery like ammunition. This wasn't just a technicality. It was the foundation of my defense, and it meant everyone fined for grass height, everyone shamed into compliance, had been pressured under rules that never legally existed. Across the room, an older man glanced at me, curious about my intensity. I nodded politely, then returned to my focus. The discovery carried weight, but it needed framing. In court, precision mattered. It wasn't enough to claim Patricia was overreaching. I had to demonstrate how, step by step, her board crossed the line between enforcement and fraud. That meant building a trail, notices citing non-existent codes, threats escalating into liens, and the financial damage flowing from their unlawful claims. By the time I stepped back into the sunlight, the folder returned to the clerk's desk. I felt a strange mix of triumph and heaviness. Triumph because the crack in her foundation was clear. Heaviness because I understood what came next. Patricia wouldn't roll over when exposed. She would double down, dragging this fight into hearings, rallies, and public shaming until her grip broke, or my reputation did. And the neighbors, caught between, would watch nervously, afraid to take sides until someone proved her wrong in a place she couldn't spin the narrative. I drove from the courthouse straight to the community coffee shop. It wasn't chance that brought me there. I knew board members often gathered in the mornings, sipping lattes while drafting the next wave of enforcement emails. Through the front window, I saw Patricia with 2 officers, heads close, voices sharp. I didn't go inside, not yet. Instead, I watched from my truck, the courthouse documents fresh in my mind. Their laughter was brittle, forced, the sound of people propping each other up on a crumbling ledge. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were plotting in plain sight while I now carried proof of their weakest point. My father had taught me that every structure has a load limit. Push hard enough in the right place and the collapse is inevitable. I'd just found Patricia's limit. It wasn't grass, it was law. And law was my terrain. As I pulled away, my phone buzzed with a new email. Another notice from the HOA, this time threatening legal action if I didn't pay within 10 days. I almost laughed. Their threats were accelerating even as their authority evaporated. They thought they were tightening the noose, but every new letter only added weight to the case I would bring against them. Patricia believed she'd cornered me, but in reality, she was writing my argument for me, one violation at a time. The oak tree swayed gently when I returned home, its branches creaking as though echoing approval. I ran my hand along the bark, grounding myself in its strength. My father's compass had pointed me here, to the truth hidden in official records, undeniable and final. Patricia wanted this, to be about appearances. I was making it about evidence, and evidence never lies. The bark of the oak still rough under my palm, I stepped back and looked at the stack of envelopes spread across my kitchen counter. Everyone bore the HOA's seal, everyone written in the same manufactured authority. I'd uncovered the truth at the courthouse, but now Patricia had given me another gift, an official deadline. 10 days. She believed the clock was her weapon, but it became mine. Pressure cuts both ways, and I knew exactly where to apply it. That evening I carried the newest notice into my office downtown. The building was quiet after hours, my drafting tools and blueprints scattered across the long table, like relics from another life. I laid the letters out in a row, aligning them edge to edge the way I would when calibrating measurements. Under the glow of the desk lamp, the inconsistencies shouted louder than they had in daylight. Different fonts, shifting legal references, citations to codes that didn't exist in state records. Patricia had built her arsenal on sand, and she didn't even realize how visible the cracks were to someone trained to read precision. I snapped photos of each letter, uploaded them to a secure folder, then began drafting a timeline. Day 1, original violation. Day 2, penalty. Day 7, escalated fine. Day 21, threat of lien. Each step stacked into a pattern of escalation, unsupported by their governing documents. It wasn't just sloppy. It was systemic overreach, and if I could see it, a judge would too. The next morning, I stopped at the county planning department. The clerk there, a wiry man with thick glasses, pulled up digital records on his monitor as I leaned across the counter. I asked for confirmation of landscaping standards enforced county-wide. He scrolled, adjusted his frames, and finally shook his head. "We don't regulate grass height," he said flatly. "That would fall to private covenants." His words landed like a hammer. The county had no standard, which meant Patricia's supposed enforcement came from nowhere. I thanked him, collected the printed confirmation he offered, and slipped it into my folder. Evidence was stacking higher than her claims. Walking out of that office, the urgency hit me full force. Patricia wasn't going to wait until day 10 to act. She thrived on spectacle, and I knew a community board meeting was scheduled for that weekend. She would use it as her stage, parading Bob forward to validate her accusations, pushing the crowd into a frenzy of judgment before I could mount my defense. The personal stakes snapped into focus. This wasn't only about fines or bylaws. If Patricia poisoned my reputation in front of the community, the damage would spread far beyond my lawn. Contracts, friendships, even the quiet respect tied to my father's name, they could all be eroded in a single evening. That realization hardened my resolve. I spread the papers across my truck hood outside the county building, the autumn breeze threatening to lift them like scattered leaves. My eyes tracked the printed confirmation again, then the HOA's threats, then the survey compass resting beside them. The metal pointed true north, steady against the shifting air. I felt my chest steady in rhythm with it. This fight wasn't abstract anymore. It was immediate, personal, and worth every ounce of energy I carried. That night, I walked the neighborhood in silence, watching lights flicker behind drawn curtains. Families cooked dinner, children's laughter spilled from backyards, and yet tension hung heavy in the air. Patricia's campaign had seeded fear so deep that even casual conversations in driveways ended quickly when my footsteps approached. They saw me as the man who stood against the board, and fear told them not to stand near me. That isolation might have broken another neighbor. For me, it sharpened focus. Fear is only powerful until someone shows it has no teeth. I paused at the oak tree before heading inside, the branches shifting in the dark like watchful sentries. I whispered to the silence, a promise more than words. She won't take this from us. The leaves rustled in response, and for a moment it felt like the tree itself carried my father's steady hand on my shoulder. The urgency was no longer abstract. It was carved into the coming weekend, the meeting where Patricia planned to make her move. But I had my own plan now, forged from law, records, and the certainty that truth carries its own momentum. The countdown had begun, and I was ready. The board meeting loomed on Saturday, and by Friday evening, the tension in the neighborhood felt electric. Patricia had blanketed inboxes with reminders that attendance was mandatory for all conscientious homeowners, her words dripping with threat disguised as civic duty. I knew she planned to use the gathering as her stage, but I also knew she needed Bob Langley to stand beside her, the reluctant witness turned unwilling ally. Without his support, her story cracked. With it, she could bend perception long enough to wound me publicly. I found Bob not at the park this time, but at the small hardware store on the edge of town. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, the smell of lumber and oil thick in the air. He stood in aisle 3, staring at paint samples he clearly didn't intend to buy. His posture sagged, shoulders caved inward, his thumb rubbing the edge of a folded paper in his pocket like a nervous tick. When he saw me, his back stiffened slightly, but his eyes darted away, unable to hold my gaze. "Bob," I said, keeping my tone even. He gave a slow nod, lips pressed tight. His hands betrayed him, though, one gripping the cart handle so hard his knuckles blanched, the other twitching against his leg in restless patterns. Body language didn't lie. The man was a battlefield of reluctance and guilt. I walked closer, careful not to corner him. "She's going to put you in front of the entire community tomorrow. She'll make it sound like you confirmed everything she claims." His jaw flexed, grinding invisible words he couldn't force out. He shifted from foot to foot, the cartwheels squeaking as he moved it back a few inches, then forward again, like a soldier unsure whether to advance or retreat. The silence grew heavier, broken only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Finally, he exhaled, a long, shaky release that deflated his frame. She told me it was my duty," he muttered, voice barely audible. He rubbed the back of his neck, fingers clawing at the skin, as if trying to dig out the pressure lodged beneath. His eyes flicked toward me, then down to the floor again. Shame, conflict, the desire to be free of her grip. It was all written in the slump of his posture and the restless fidget of his hands. "She's using you," I said. "But you know the truth. You've seen my lawn. You know it's not what she says." His breathing quickened, shallow and uneven. He tapped the cart handle 3 times, then let go suddenly as if it burned him. When he finally met my eyes, they held the weary look of a man standing at a crossroads. His shoulders lifted in a slight shrug, but the movement wasn't resignation. It was surrender to inevitability. Deep down, he knew silence would destroy him more than truth ever could. "I can't lie for her," he whispered, voice trembling. His hand trembled too, gripping the folded paper in his pocket until it crumpled. That small gesture, that clutch of paper, said more than a confession. It was the weight of a man breaking free. He wasn't ready to stand tall yet, but the shift had begun. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "All you have to do is tell what you saw. Nothing more. Let the truth carry itself." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, but his body said the rest. His stance straightened, if only slightly. His fingers stopped their restless twitching. His chest expanded with a fuller breath than before. He wasn't strong enough to fight Patricia head-on, but he was strong enough to stop being her weapon. As I left the hardware store, I glanced back once. Bob was still standing in the aisle, gripping the cart, staring into the rows of paint samples like they held answers he hadn't found yet. But his body was different, no longer collapsed but braced. He had chosen his side, even if he hadn't spoken it aloud. And tomorrow, when Patricia dragged him into the spotlight, I knew hesitation would turn into the fracture she couldn't control. The meeting was less than 24 hours away. Patricia thought she had a witness. What she didn't realize was that witnesses can change everything when fear gives way to conscience. The night before the board meeting, my dining room became a war room. The stack of violation notices lay spread across the table, each marked with notes and highlighted errors. Beside them sat the county confirmation that no lawn height ordinance existed, a quiet bomb waiting to be detonated. The compass from my father's toolbox rested at the center, anchoring the papers like a reminder of why I fought. Tomorrow, Patricia would try to break me in front of the neighborhood, but she didn't know I was ready to expose the hollow frame of her authority. I opened my laptop and drafted a series of charts that compared the HOA's letters to the official records. On one side, Patricia's citations, sloppily pulled from mismatched statutes. On the other, the county's actual regulations, clean and simple, none mentioning grass. Line by line, I built a visual contrast that even the least legally minded neighbor could understand. This wasn't about technicalities hidden in fine print. It was about showing in plain daylight how her foundation didn't exist at all. Around midnight, I printed the charts, stacking them neatly into folders. I added copies of the county confirmation, each stamped and dated, proof that carried the kind of weight Patricia couldn't spin. Evidence doesn't tremble. It doesn't bow to threats. It sits silent and undeniable, waiting for the right stage. And tomorrow, that stage would be hers, not mine. She wanted a spectacle. I would give her one, only not the kind she expected. Sleep came in shallow stretches, my mind racing with angles and outcomes. At dawn, I walked the neighborhood once more. The lawns gleamed from over-trimming, neighbors cutting grass down to stubble in fear of fines. Windows flickered with early lights, curtains twitching as I passed. Fear hung heavier than the dew, and it fueled me. Patricia had built her empire on that fear, but I was about to replace it with something stronger, proof. By mid-morning, I was back in my office downtown, reviewing my plan one last time. I rehearsed quietly, not the words themselves, but the order of presentation. Start with the HOA's threats, escalate through their citations, then reveal the missing ordinance like pulling the curtain from a stage trick. The structure mattered. Patricia thrived on chaos and intimidation, but clarity would dismantle her faster than fire. I kept reminding myself of one truth. I didn't need to win their favor with charm. I only needed to make the facts unavoidable. Around noon, I received an unexpected message. A neighbor I barely knew, an older woman named Carol, slipped a note into my mailbox. She wrote that Patricia had fined her last year for a lawn violation too, nearly $4,000, and she'd paid out of fear of foreclosure. She wished me luck tomorrow and said, "If you win, we all win." I held the note longer than I expected, the words cutting deeper than her intent. This wasn't just my fight anymore. Every page on my dining table represented more than my family's legacy. It represented years of intimidation spread across every house in Willow Creek. That afternoon, I carried the folders and charts back to the community center, the same place Patricia had posted my violation on the bulletin board. The room was empty, the fluorescent lights humming above neat rows of chairs waiting for tomorrow's audience. I set one folder down on the lectern just to feel its weight against the wood. Tomorrow, when Patricia tried to break me, I would meet her on her stage with something she couldn't erase, the truth documented in her own absence of authority. Before leaving, I walked to the back of the room where the bulletin board still stood. The red stamped copy of my violation had been replaced with a new notice, warning of consequences for non-compliance. I smiled grimly. Let it hang there. Tomorrow it would look like the relic of a regime already collapsing. My job tonight was simple: rest, steady my resolve, and prepare to let the truth do the work. Back at home, I stood beneath the oak tree one last time before dusk, its branches arched high, shadows stretching long across the yard, a silent witness to everything Patricia tried to erase. I pressed my palm against its bark, feeling the grooves my father once traced, and whispered, "Tomorrow we make this right." The tree didn't answer, but the steadiness in its roots was all the reply I needed. Dawn on the day of the meeting carried a heavy stillness, the kind that presses against your chest before a storm breaks. I woke early, gathered the folders and charts I'd prepared, and loaded them into a weathered briefcase that once belonged to my father. The leather creaked with each snap of the clasps, its worn surface carrying the same durability I felt I'd inherited from him. Today wasn't about bluster or bravado. It was about precision, discipline, and the quiet strength of evidence. Patricia wanted theater, but I would bring the architecture of truth. By mid-morning, I was at the public library. The community center was set for the meeting later, but I needed a neutral place to finalize my preparation. The library's study rooms were lined with oak tables and tall windows, a space filled with silence broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the turning of pages. I spread the documents across the table, building my sequence one more time. First, the HOA letters with inflated fines. Second, the timeline showing escalation into lien threats. Third, the county's confirmation that no ordinance existed. And finally, the amendments to the HOA's own documents, the glaring absence of any grass height standard. Each piece alone proved inconsistency. Together, they told a story of authority fabricated from nothing. I rehearsed how I'd present them, not to charm, but to corner. Patricia could sneer, she could shout, but she couldn't change ink stamped on official records. Every chart I stacked into the briefcase was another nail in the coffin of her false authority. As I worked, a librarian passed by, glancing at the piles of paper. She offered a polite smile, but said nothing, and I was grateful. This wasn't a fight I wanted to explain to strangers, yet in that moment, surrounded by quiet shelves, I realized something profound. This case was no longer just about me or even the oak tree. It was about restoring balance to a neighborhood living under intimidation. Carol's note from the day before echoed in my head. If you win, we all win. That weight steadied me more than it burdened me. Around noon, I left the library and drove to a printing shop downtown. The clerk helped me bind the charts into presentation packets, clean, professional, impossible to dismiss as casual claims. As the printer hummed, I thought about Patricia's strategy. She had fear, spectacle, and a willing audience. I had preparation, evidence, and the unexpected support of a witness who no longer wanted to be her shield. Bob's trembling hands and shifting eyes at the hardware store replayed in my mind. When pushed into the spotlight tonight, he would not hold steady under her script. His conscience would show, and when it did, Patricia's stage would collapse. By late afternoon, I drove back into Willow Creek. The streets were lined with cars, neighbors hurrying home early to secure seats at the meeting. Curtains parted as I passed, eyes tracking me, the way villagers once watched trials in the town square. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical, but all curious. Patricia had framed me as the villain. Tonight they would learn otherwise. I parked by the oak tree, set the briefcase on the hood of my truck, and rested my hand on its lid. My father's compass lay inside alongside the documents, the metal needle fixed and unwavering. I traced the grooves in the leather case, inhaled deeply, and felt the nervous energy settle into focus. This wasn't a gamble anymore. It was execution. I had the plan, the proof, and the timing. All that remained was to walk into her theater and dismantle it piece by piece. As twilight spread across the neighborhood, I closed the case and carried it into the house. I dressed deliberately. Nothing flashy, just a pressed shirt and jacket that spoke of quiet professionalism. Patricia would come armed with arrogance and spectacle. I would come armed with law and precision. And when the lights buzzed on in the community center, every neighbor would see the difference. The oak tree rustled in the wind as I stepped back outside, briefcase in hand. Its branches swayed like an unspoken blessing, steady and unbroken. Tonight, under those humming fluorescent lights, I would finally turn Patricia's false authority against her. The preparation was finished. The stage was set. All that remained was the confrontation. The fluorescent lights in the community center flickered as I walked in, briefcase in hand. Rows of folding chairs filled the hall. Neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, their chatter a low hum of unease. Patricia had done her work well. The turnout was larger than I'd ever seen. She stood at the front, flanked by two board members, her tailored suit sharp, her smile sharper. She looked like a queen on a throne of paper, ready to make an example of me. I chose a seat in the second row, close enough to meet her eyes, but not so close I looked desperate. My briefcase rested on my lap, weighty with truth. Patricia tapped her gavel against the lectern, calling for silence. The crowd quieted instantly, the sound of shifting chairs echoing like a drumbeat. She began with her usual flourish, a speech about protecting property values and preserving community standards. Each phrase was met with nods from the faithful, though I caught flickers of doubt in the back rows. Not everyone was convinced. Then she moved to the heart of her performance. She gestured toward a large poster board behind her, plastered with blown-up images of my lawn, angles cropped to exaggerate shadows, blades of grass made to look like towering weeds. Gasps rose from the crowd as if they were seeing a jungle instead of a yard. Patricia thrived on reaction, and tonight she had them hooked. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed the verdict was already written. "Your negligence threatens the very stability of Willow Creek Estates. This board has no choice but to pursue legal remedies. And to prove the severity of your violations, we've called upon an expert witness." The room shifted as all eyes turned toward the side door. Bob Langley entered slowly, shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor. His hands trembled as he clutched a folded piece of paper, his steps uneven. Patricia smiled at him, like a puppeteer pulling strings. "Mr. Langley has spent decades in groundskeeping," she announced. "His testimony will confirm the extent of this violation." Bob reached the lectern, his fingers fumbling with the paper until it crumpled in his grip. He cleared his throat, but no words came. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. His eyes darted toward me, then back to Patricia, then down again. His entire body spoke the war inside him, knees bent as if ready to buckle, shoulders rising with each shallow breath, hands twisting the paper until it tore slightly at the corner. Patricia leaned in, whispering something sharp enough to cut. His jaw clenched, but still he hesitated. The crowd stirred, restless, sensing the tension. Patricia forced the moment, turning to him with a glare meant to steady his tongue. But Bob's body betrayed him. Sweat beaded at his temple, his foot tapped rapidly against the floor, and when he finally opened his mouth, his voice cracked. I saw the lawn," he stammered, "but it didn't look—" His words broke off. His eyes locked on mine for half a second, wide and pleading, then darted away again. Patricia jumped in quickly, filling the void. "Thank you, Mr. Langley," she said firmly, cutting him off before the truth slipped out. She clapped, her hands together, trying to guide the audience back under her control. "As you can see, even our expert acknowledges the scope of the problem." But the room wasn't as convinced as she hoped. Bob's body language told a different story, and people had seen it. A murmur spread, neighbors whispering, questioning. Doubt had slipped into the cracks of her narrative, and doubt was contagious. I rose slowly, briefcase in hand, and walked to the front. Patricia's eyes narrowed, but I didn't look at her. I set the briefcase on the table, clicked it open, and withdrew the first folder. "If this is about standards," I said, laying the county's printed confirmation across the lectern, "then let's start with what the law actually says." I slid the document forward, the official seal gleaming under the harsh lights. Gasps again, this time sharper. Patricia froze, her smile faltering for the first time that evening. The meeting had shifted. Her spectacle wasn't the only performance anymore, and as I stood there with the weight of truth in my hands, I knew the real confrontation had just begun. The county seal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its authority impossible to miss. For a moment, the room went utterly silent. Then the whispers started again, this time sharper, questioning, no longer focused on me, but on Patricia. She reached for the document, snatching it up like she could erase its weight by clutching it tighter. "This is irrelevant," she said, her voice straining against the murmurs rising around her. "The HOA has every right to establish stricter standards than the county." I let her words hang, then opened the second folder. "Stricter standards?" I said, sliding out the articles of incorporation. "Then, where are they written? Because these are your founding documents, Patricia, and nowhere, not once, does it mention grass height, 3 inches, or any landscaping standard you've used to bleed this community dry." I laid the pages out across the table, each one stamped and signed, undeniable in their emptiness where she swore authority existed. The crowd shifted forward in their chairs, curiosity turning into suspicion. One man in the back rose halfway, craning to see the documents. A woman whispered sharply to her neighbor, her eyes fixed on Patricia. The momentum in the room had turned, and she felt it. Her smile stretched too wide, her hand gripping the edge of the lectern until her knuckles went pale. Patricia tried again. "These are technicalities. The board has broad discretion." Her voice cracked beneath the weight of her own words. She looked toward Bob, still standing off to the side, as if his trembling presence could prop her up. But Bob was unraveling before everyone's eyes. His shoulders slumped, his torn paper dangling from limp fingers. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his gaze darting between me, the documents, and the crowd. His lips moved without sound, forming half words he swallowed before they escaped. "Bob," Patricia said sharply like an order, "tell them." She needed him to close the gap, to salvage the narrative, but his body betrayed him. He shook his head faintly, almost invisible, then pressed his palms flat against the lectern as if to steady himself. His knees bent under the weight of expectation, and when he finally spoke, His voice cracked loud enough for the entire hall to hear. I can't lie for you, Patricia." The words shattered the room. Gasps, murmurs, even a few audible exclamations rippled through the crowd. Bob straightened slightly, his chest heaving as though a boulder had rolled off it. He looked at me briefly, eyes full of regret, but also relief, then faced the neighbors. Her rule about grass, it was never written. She told me to say it anyway. I can't do it. His hands trembled openly now, but the tremor no longer looked like fear. It looked like release. The crowd erupted. A man shouted from the back, "She fined me last year for the same thing." A woman stood, her voice shaking with fury. "I paid thousands. Are you saying it was all fake?" Conversations overlapped, anger building like a rising tide. Patricia slammed the gavel, demanding order, but no one quieted. Her authority had fractured in front of everyone, and no strike of wood could repair it. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the noise. "This isn't about lawns. It's about abuse of power. She fined us under rules that never legally existed. And tonight, thanks to Mr. Langley's honesty, you all know the truth." I spread the documents wide, the evidence visible to anyone close enough to see. Neighbors surged forward, some snapping photos with their phones, others leaning closer to read. The tide had turned fully, and Patricia's composure crumbled, her face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing without words. She tried to shout above the crowd, but her voice was swallowed whole. The neighbors weren't listening anymore. They were talking to each other, recounting their own experiences, tallying years of intimidation suddenly stripped of legitimacy. Every whisper grew into a chorus, a demand for accountability that no gavel could silence. Bob stepped back from the lectern, his breathing still uneven, but his posture taller than it had been in years. He wasn't her pawn anymore. The truth had set him free, and in doing so, it had freed the community from her spell. I stood beside him, steady and unflinching, the weight of my father's compass in my pocket, reminding me that roots hold firm even in storms. Patricia had her spectacle, but it ended with her unraveling in front of the very people she once ruled, and I had only one folder left to open. The room was chaos. Neighbors crowded the lectern, voices overlapping in a storm of anger and disbelief. Patricia's gavel struck the wood over and over, but the sharp cracks were swallowed by demands for answers. Her carefully constructed authority had collapsed in front of her, and the fragments scattered across the crowd like shards of glass. I let the uproar rise for a moment before lifting the final folder from my briefcase. The weight of it steadied me, and when I opened it on the table, the room fell into a hush of anticipation. "These," I said, laying out the pages, "are the lien threats Patricia has mailed to me and others. Every one of them cites a rule that does not exist. Every dollar she's demanded under those claims is fraudulent." I tapped the official seal on the county's confirmation page. And under state law, fraudulent assessments don't just disappear, they carry consequences. I held up the statute, my finger underlining the clause, double damages, payable within 72 hours of judgment. The silence broke with gasps, then angry shouts aimed not at me, but at the board. Patricia's face drained of color. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. One of her board members leaned in, whispering frantically, but she brushed him off with a sharp shake of her head. Her eyes darted toward Bob, as if still hoping his loyalty could patch the wound. But Bob wasn't trembling anymore. He stood off to the side, shoulders squared, his torn paper discarded on the floor, his jaw set firm, his gaze steady, no longer shifting or darting away. His body spoke more loudly than his words ever could. He was done carrying her lies. I turned to the crowd. This doesn't end with me. Every neighbor here who has paid a fine under this so-called lawn standard has been taken advantage of. Tonight, you have a choice. Stay silent and the abuse continues. Or stand with me and we take this to court together. The response was immediate, a rumble of agreement, voices rising in unison. A man shouted, "Count me in!" Others followed, hands lifted, voices overlapping in a chorus of support. For the first time since Patricia's reign began, the fear that had kept them quiet dissolved into something stronger. Solidarity. The board's attempts to restore order crumbled under the momentum. Neighbors swarmed the front, demanding resignations, demanding refunds, demanding justice. Patricia backed away from the lectern, her gavel slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the hall like a final surrender. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for control she no longer had. The queen had been dethroned, not by one man alone, but by the collective force of a community that had finally woken up. I closed my briefcase, the folders neatly stacked inside. My work here wasn't finished. The court would formalize the ruling, and the board would be forced to repay what they'd taken. But the battle had already been won. Patricia had lost the one thing she valued most, the perception of power. Without it, her reign ended in that very room. Bob caught my eye as I stepped back from the lectern. He gave a single nod, small but resolute. His body, once folded in fear, now stood straight, unshaken. He had chosen truth, and in doing so, helped free us all. Outside, the night air was cool, the stars faint behind a veil of clouds. Neighbors gathered in small groups across the parking lot, voices buzzing with energy, no longer whispering in fear, but speaking openly, defiantly. Carol approached me, her eyes wet but fierce. "You did it," she said. I shook my head. "We did it." Her smile carried the relief of years of silence finally broken. The oak tree loomed in the distance beyond my yard, its branches stretching high into the night, a living witness to promises kept. My father's compass pressed against my side in my jacket pocket, steady as ever, reminding me why I fought. Patricia's flyers and threats would soon be nothing more than paper in the wind. What remained was the community, stronger now, no longer blind to the truth. And as I looked around at the neighbors who had once turned away, I realized this was never just about defending my yard. It was about giving everyone back their voice. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.